Welcome to Life and Sirens, Behind and on the Scene, a podcast by first responders. We're your hosts, Sophie,
Jamie,
and Aubrey.
The content provided in this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered medical advice. The views and opinions expressed by the hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policies or positions of any medical institutions, emergency medical services, or healthcare organizations. Patient privacy is a top priority, and all discussions involving real-world emergency situations are de-identified and altered to ensure confidentiality. Always consult with a qualified healthcare professional or your local EMS protocols before making any decisions regarding patient care or medical practices. Listener discretion is advised, as some topics may include discussions of real-world emergency situations.
Welcome to our Halloween special. This episode is going to be modeled like our fireside chat episode, so a little bit of a shorter episode, but it is called Witch's Brew Toxicology. So we're going to be talking about some unusual overdoses and exposures. I'm going to be talking about mercury poisoning.
I'm going to be talking about plants and toxicity found in the wild.
I'm going to be talking about Imodium and DXM.
Pretty interesting menagerie. All right, let's talk about mercury poisoning. So mercury exposure typically occurs by inhaling or ingesting mercury. So the elemental mercury is the kind that you would see, in a thermometer, the shiny, wiggly mercury. But then you can also have methyl mercury poisoning from contaminated fish. Yeah, it sounds gross. Right? Okay, so stay away from contaminated fish, whatever that means.
Yeah, how do you know if they're...
I don't think you did.
Aren't all fish contaminated?
Yes, because they have that weird sea flavor.
Oh my god.
Ugh.
She does not like seafood.
I mean, I don't like it when you say it that way.
I don't either.
Alright, so the symptoms you're going to find in mercury poisoning are, we'll break them down by body system. So neurological, you're going to have tremors, mood swings, memory loss, ataxia, cognitive deficits, and severe cases, you may even have seizures and coma. That would be a lot of mercury, though. It actually takes a very significant amount to get to that point. Then we have some sensory issues like blurred vision, hearing loss, numbness and tingling in the extremities. And then for GI, nausea, vomiting, metallic taste in the mouth. If you ingest it by mouth, that is literally what poison control told me. I just thought that was funny. Like, you're gonna have a metallic taste in your mouth if you eat metal.
Just be aware.
Be aware.
Just be aware.
I'm like, man.
Yeah. Watch out. It'd surprise you.
Kids lick coins a lot.
Yeah. Respiratory, you're gonna have cough, chest pain, and potentially respiratory failure, but that is more like industrial mercury when people are inhaling the vapors. So that would essentially a chemical burn in your airway. And then kidney damage is one of the most common side effects of chronic mercury exposure. Fun fact, this is pretty cool. So if you've ever heard of Mad Hatter syndrome is associated with mercury poisoning. Mercury has a long history in alchemy where it was thought to be a mystical substance capable of turning base metals into gold. They were wrong. The phrase mad as a hatter originates from the mercury poisoning hat makers suffered due to its use in felt processing, making this a perfect example of real-life madness caused by toxic exposure, which I thought was so perfect for our holiday episode. A lot of the times when you're encountering actual patients who are going to be experiencing mercury poisoning, it's chronic poisoning. And they obviously do not know it's mercury poisoning, unless it's like one of those industrial situations. But most of the time, by the time that we're seeing them, if it's significant, it's chronic exposure. And the most common symptoms are nervous system, like movement disorders, and then ataxic gait. Those are like the two. Yes. So hopefully it doesn't get to that point, but most of the time that's like the other symptoms are so subtle, like nausea, headache. intermittent blurred vision. Like, it's just so subtle. And the kind of people I imagine who are having chronic exposure to mercury are probably like some tough people.
I'm just trying to think about where you would encounter mercury.
It's usually industry specific. I do know it can cause some pretty significant congenital defects, and they're usually neurological, which is sad. So cognitive delay and things like that.
So it can cause congenital defects, like if mom is exposed to mercury during pregnancy.
She would have to have
but
it
not
put
if
on.
she's just like had a prior exposure.
Right.
Gotcha.
These are some of the places you can find mercury. So, old thermometers. Actually, I had one of these as a child with the mercury in it. Did you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did too.
The old blood pressure devices, like way back when, they used mercury.
Because it's all measured in millimeters of mercury.
Yes. There you go. Fluorescent light bulbs, neon signs. In gold mining, which there comes your industry specific. And then organic mercury, or the methyl mercury that we were talking about, that's in fish. Gross, but most common in shark, swordfish, king mackerel, and tuna.
Oh, contaminated
So,
tuna.
do you ever hear them say don't eat tuna while you're pregnant? It's because
That's
the mercury
why.
exposure.
Oh.
Yes. And then generally you can have like contamination of food and water. So in some regions there's a lot of mercury polluting water sources, which can lead to methyl mercury poisoning, which is that other subtle one that you find in the tuna. And then there's actually a lot of inorganic mercury. Don't ask me. I only do medicine. I don't do rock science. Element science. Anyway. Skin lightening creams and cosmetics. So that could be a chronic exposure.
Okay.
Fungicides and pesticides, which honestly just makes sense. In my brain, those things are just gross.
Yeah.
Chock full of
I feel like
things.
mercury's the least of our worries with those.
Yeah.
Industry. I literally don't know how to say this, but chloralkali plants. CHLORALKALI. And dental offices.
I knew they were trying to kill us.
What do
I
they do
knew
with
it.
the mercury in the dentist?
There's a certain type of filling that contains elemental mercury mixed with silver and other metals. Wow, this isn't really a modern thing.
My mom has one of those.
Right, so it's not super modern, but it could be an occupational exposure for these providers who are doing this when this was typical. A lot of antique things that look metal are actually not. They just made it look metal and they used the cheapest thing possible, like mercury. So that's cute of them.
Bum, bum, bum.
Yeah.
Between the mercury and the lead paint, nobody stood a chance.
No,
They really didn't. You could have mercury and lead poisoning
Also-
because you found one cute face.
really though. And what is
The metals are just out to
material?
get ya.
But wrapping things up, the most common exposures are the inhalation, the ingestion, and the dermal exposure. And actually, it's found that modern, the most common is the dermal exposure, so like the creams,
Wow.
which is, I feel like we're getting these from like Temu. So
Yeah.
maybe not
Yeah. I also feel like you're like excessively applying them.
right. It has to be a lot.
It's got to be a lot.
Mhm.
Everybody go home and read your cream.
Read your creams.
Whatever
your
various face body creams you use, read them.
For treatments, they use chelation therapy, so drugs that like bind with the mercury. There's very specific drugs, like dimercaprol is the name of the drug that specifically binds to mercury. And then generally you're just going to provide supportive care, so symptom management. In extreme cases, you may need to get benzos for seizures. That's more of that like acute exposure. And then in those severe cases where you have the inhalation injuries, just treat like you would an inhalation burn. And moving on to something way less sinister, but actually just as sinister.
So a little bit of background on me. Before I got into EMS, I was a manager at a greenhouse. So I am a big nerd for all things plants, and I hope that you are a little bit too, because this is about to get really nerdy. There are a couple of very popular plants that are actually very dangerous that a lot of people don't know about. Number one, which I just always like talking about this one because we actually see it a lot, is foxglove. Very pretty flower, but it's used to make digoxin. So if you ever just randomly eat a foxglove,
You're gonna die.
That's not good. Not good. For those of you who don't know, digoxin is used to treat heart failure and AFib. It's an antiarrhythmic, inotrope, so obviously you don't want to consume too much of that. Next is hydrangea. Everybody loves the hydrangea. Very popular. They actually contain cyanogenic glycosides. I know, which when ingested can produce cyanide within your own body.
That is way cool and terrifying.
I know, isn't that wild?
Especially because they're everywhere.
Oh yeah, they're everywhere.
They're beautiful.
And they're so beautiful.
Don't eat it.
Don't eat it, yeah. Philodendron and Dieffenbachia, which I just love the name of them.
Dieffenbachia.
Dieffenbachia. They contain calcium oxalate crystals, which sounds really scary. It just irritates your mouth, but I just thought that was cool. And then a couple of plants that are used to make medications that we are very familiar with. Obviously, everybody knows about the poppy, the opium poppy, used to make morphine, codeine. Then, have you guys ever heard of like a yew plant?
No.
It's spelled Y-E-W.
No.
They're like little bushes.
No.
Mm-mm.
Well, it contains Taxol, which is used to make chemotherapy drugs.
Get away from that thing.
I know.
It just grows wildly?
Yes. But it's a very specific yew. It's the Pacific yew. Okay.
That was good.
Thank you. And then my favorite plant, which if you know me, you know I've made you try this plant because I think this is so fun.
Yes, you
The
have.
toothache plant, which the blooms of it, they grow like little tiny bud flowers. And once it is bloomed, you can pick it, and if you put it in your mouth and chew it, it will turn your whole mouth numb. It's like the OG lidocaine.
And it works.
it works.
It's pretty wild.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it is her favorite plant. She's made us all chew it.
I have the sensitive fern, which we all have one.
I drank so
We all
well.
had one.
Okay, well, some people let theirs die, but Soph's is doing so well.
It's
That's
so great.
I saw it when I
We'll
came
put it
in.
on our Instagram.
Yeah. It looks like a fern, and whenever you touch it, it will curl up. And then at nighttime, it also curls up and goes to sleep.
It's so cute.
Has a lot of fluids.
It's literally the cutest.
And he likes to take a nappy.
Sometimes forever. He lives in Jamie's house.
Okay, well.
In James' house, it took a forever nap.
Yep.
And then just a little bonus fact for you. This really has no medicinal purposes, but there is a plant, and it is called cleome. You can look it up. It is spelled Cleome, cleome, and it is a cousin to cannabis. And when I mean cousin to cannabis, I mean like looks just like cannabis, smells just like cannabis, grows just like cannabis. It is crazy, but you can buy it at pretty much like any garden center. And it's cleome. It really has no medicinal purposes, but it looks just like
I feel like that would be
cannabis.
risky to have in your yard.
I know. Whenever I worked at the garden center, I would walk past it and get a whiff of it, and I'd be like, what in the world? And it'd just be the cleome.
Why would you want that at your house?
It actually does produce really pretty flowers.
Okay.
Okay, all right.
But the greenery of the plant looks
Is
just like cannabis.
suspicious.
Very suspicious. So, if you're feeling wild for literally no reason, buy some cleome.
All right.
That's all I have for nerdy plants.
Well, mine is not related to my personal likes and general existence. So I'm talking about two different medications. They are both over-the-counter medications. They did not start that way, but they have landed that way. So the first one is loperamide, and it's probably on every me mom papaw's med list you've ever read. It's Imodium. But it can be abused because it is opiate related. And so some people misuse it. Now you have to have really, really high doses to abuse it. So like generally when you take Imodium, you take 2 milligrams and then you increase by 2 milligrams until your problem resolves. It's 16 milligrams max daily. Well, as you try to head into the opiate-like effects of Imodium, between 60 and 100 milligrams give you like a mild opiate effect that doesn't last very long because it has a really hard time crossing the blood-brain barrier And so your body will metabolize it and kick it on out of there. But upwards of 200 milligrams, so 200 or more, that will have pretty significant opiate effects. The problem is, that in these really high doses, there's lots of other things that will cause some cardiac issues. And by some cardiac issues, I mean bad ones. So prolonged abuse of this is problematic, because even with like one technical overdose can cause prolonged QT syndrome, and it can also cause torsades. And so it does this by really just screwing with some enzymes, which causes your cardiac function to decrease, and then you end up in these arrhythmias. The treatment for these arrhythmias are like you would treat them when you see them in any other regard. Torsades is going to be 2 milligrams of mag. Follow your local protocols for torsades. It's the same. Just because it's induced by this medication doesn't mean you treat it differently. But it also has a propensity to move into VFib much quicker than torsades normally would, so get the pads on them. Outside of your cardiac issues, it can cause respiratory depression. Now, these are in like really, really high doses where it will cause respiratory depression, but because it has an opiate-like effect, it takes a long time for the opioid receptors to bind, but once they do, it's kind of hard to get them off. So it also takes huge doses of Narcan to get them off. You start at like 10 milligrams and then just keep going until you get some kind of effect. Overuse of it, so like long-term use, can cause a lot of GI effects, because essentially it functions by binding to your opiate receptors in your GI tract, but then it goes through your first pass metabolism, and it's no longer absorbed through the blood-brain barrier, so you don't have to worry about the secondary effects. That's like why it's functional for treatment of diarrhea, but that's also why it can be called, this is a fun fact, like Soph Hatter, Mad Hatter, it's called the poor man's methadone, because people that are trying to recover from substance abuse will use it in relatively higher doses in order to mitigate withdrawal symptoms from opiates or to gain desired effects. And because it's over the counter, I think it feels a little less sketchy. So as far as treatment goes, after your general medical treatment, so like support your airway, high doses of Narcan if that's what you suspect, clearly IV, fluids, all of those things, but make sure that you notify your ER that you're transporting to that you think that this is a Imodium overdose. So the second one, I don't know what kind of childhoods you guys had, but in my high school, robotrippin was kind of a thing. And so it is quercetin, so it's cough medicine, but the active ingredient that makes it the robotrippin kind of part is dextromethorphan, so it's DXM. So you'll see that on the label of most cough medicines that you get. And so when it's taken in really high doses, it has psychoactive effects. So it has stimulant-like effects. And so the reason that you would take it, so your desired effect, would be hallucinations and dissociation. So really high doses can give you a sense of detachment from reality, hallucinations, and confusion. So there's different levels of dextromethorphan when you take it. If you take lower doses, so that like 100 to 200 milligram range, users will feel a mild euphoria, and you can have some change in your perception. 200 to 400 milligrams, you can be moderately dissociated, and that can alter your sensory perception and give you mild hallucinations. And then in high doses, so that's 500 to 1500 milligrams or more, you'll have strong dissociative effects similar to ketamine or PCP. If you ever have encountered anyone that's done triple Cs or is robotrippin in the moment, they will seem like they're on like very strong psychoactive drugs. They have really wild eyes. They also get dry mouth and kind of like rigid muscle tone. And so a lot of times you'll see them doing something kind of strange with their jaw. We used to have a patient in our zone that did this a lot. We became very familiar with the side effects of it. The regular dose is not to exceed 120 milligrams in one day. So you're significantly over the recommended dose for these. So when you're looking at dextromethorphan, one thing that you need to really watch out for is seizures. So it has an effect on some of the receptors in the brain, which control like neuronal communication between your neurons. And so the problem is that it decreases their ability to communicate with one another. And so you end up with just like excessive firing. It's your NMDA receptors. And you end up with just this excessive firing, which is why you're more likely to have seizures. In the event that you have a patient like this, you treat it with benzos, like your protocols tell you to. They can be more difficult to stop, but you do need to be prepared for those. It can also cause serotonin syndrome. It acts on your serotonin receptors. And so in high doses, especially if it's combined with any kind of antidepressants, it can cause serotonin syndrome. And so then you can also see within those hallucinations, confusions, agitation, muscle rigidity that we talked about, and seizures as well. It has stimulant effects. So it also acts on your dopamine and your norepi pathways, which can cause an excitatory effect. This hyperactivity can overstimulate the brain and can also lead to seizures. So really the big thing with that is seizures. So between these two meds, they both kind of have opiate-like effects at higher quantities, but they get there in different directions. So if you get in really, really high doses of dextromethorphan, you will also have a respiratory depression kind of effect, because in those high doses, it can also act on opiate receptors, but it will be a wild ride to get there, and you'll probably be in the ICU for quite a while. With both of these, really high doses of Narcan are required. And then benzos for seizures, mag for torsades. And yeah, that is the over-the-counter toxicity talk.
Well, as we close the cauldron on this episode, that'll wrap things up. Remember, toxic substances aren't just the stuff of spooky stories. They can be found closer to home than you think. If you ever suspect a poisoning, there's no harm in calling poison control. That number is 1-800-222-1222. Thanks for tuning in. Stay safe. We will see you next week, actually in just a few days, because we added this fun episode in. And don't forget to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TikTok, Instagram, and if you feel so inclined, Facebook.
Happy spooky season! This has been Life and Sirens, produced by 3 nerds trying to bring you content that you might actually care about.